What I would like now to do is to turn to the person who's been working as the research and communication consultant on this project, Francesca Pierigh, who's done the main coordination of the research for the project. She's an Italian based in Berlin, has a long-standing involvement on working on refugee rights with various organizations, including the European Council on Refugees and Exile. So we look forward to seeing the presentation of the results of this report.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Yes, I've worked on the Refugees Reporting project since March, and I have to say it's a real pleasure to see it all now coming together and to be able to tell you more about it. I think the video has already raised some very interesting points in relation to the project, and I will now try to give you a bit of an overview of the project activities as well as some of the key findings. So Refugees Reporting, as Stephen already mentioned, consisted mainly of two strands of activities. On one hand, a media monitoring, which took place in 7 European countries across 3 days between the end of May and June 2017. And on the other hand, outreach activities with refugee-led organizations and migrants-led organizations and media professionals to listen to their voices as well as to gather their inputs into the project itself. So the media monitoring took place in Greece, Italy, Spain, Serbia, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Norway, thanks to groups of volunteers in each of these countries who carried out the selection and analysis of articles from print and online newspapers and of tweets from the Twitter feeds of media houses. The methodology for the media monitoring was developed largely following the methodology of the Global Media Monitoring Project, which is one of WAC's flagship projects, and it's the world's largest and longest running analysis of the representation of gender in the media. Following this methodology, we had two parts to the analysis. The first one was a quantitative analysis, and you can see on the screen a sample of what was used as a coding sheet for print newspapers. So this was a set of questions and codes which was aimed at providing us with an objective assessment of the representation of refugees and migrants in the news. And a smaller number of articles were also then analyzed from a qualitative point of view, which is a more in-depth analysis, which allowed us to gather examples of good and bad practice. And you can find some of these examples presented as case studies within the report. As for the outreach activities, because of course the project builds on the promotion of communications rights, it was extremely important to hear and involve the people who were in a way or another affected by the project activities and by the project objectives. So we're talking about refugees and migrants on one hand and media professionals on the others. This took the form of surveys which were carried out with a total of 9 refugee and migrants-led organizations and groups from across Europe. And these surveys were meant to understand what are the current communication practices and strategies of these groups, as well as previous experience with the media and how was this experience. With journalists, 10 interviews were carried out with journalists from different aspects of the profession and again from across Europe to understand, on the other hand, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and what are the needs that journalists have when they carry out their work on migration and asylum. As a consequence of these outreach activities, we organized a consultation between representatives of refugee groups and media professionals because we wanted to provide a space and a platform for open discussion, for meeting and communication between representatives of those groups, because as has become clear through the project, such occasions are very rare. And the consultation was organized in September here in Brussels, thanks to the assistance of the European Federation of Journalists and International Federation of Journalists. So this is a bit of an overview of the activities, and now moving on to the findings of the media monitoring. The first result really comes from the small overall sample that the volunteers in all the countries were able to gather. And this in itself is a result in that it speaks to the less prominence of the topic in the news, at least insofar as the monitoring period and the countries concerned are concerned. And because of this small sample and because of the very big variations that you can see across countries, it's important to highlight that this study does not aim to be a comprehensive analysis of the media in the countries which participated, but rather it points to key patterns of representations that became visible throughout the monitoring period for the countries which participated in the monitoring. The second result regards the presence of refugees and migrants in the news. So of all the articles and tweets, all the items that were analyzed, which dealt in one way or another with the topic of asylum and migration, only 21% of them in total identify a specific refugee or migrant. So this can partially be explained because the majority of the articles and the tweets were found to belong to the broad topic of politics, whereby we assume that the main characters, so to say, in those stories would be politicians and legislators. However, this still points to an identification of the topic of asylum and migration with the political level, rather than with the ground and with the people who are, in the end, directly affected by the policies and the laws that are being discussed at the political level. And if we look then within this group of people, so within the 21%, some groups are much less present in the news than others. This is the case for women, for example, which are present only in a little more than a quarter that the news which mention refugees and migrants. But I will leave it to Spokman to comment on the representation of refugee women in the news, so I won't say more about this. It's not just the gender, however, that makes a difference, it's also the nationality. And if we look at the main regions of origin of people in the news who are identified as refugees and migrants, clearly the majority are identified as coming from the Middle East, where Syria is, of course, one of the biggest drivers of displacement. However, Afghans are the second largest group of asylum applicants in the European Union, yet they are only the fourth most represented group, together with people coming from other countries from Central Asia. And if we look within the 40%, which represents all the other countries which are not, all the other regions which are not explicitly mentioned, there is a 2% from West African countries. And Nigerians currently are one of the largest communities of people in Italy, but not only in Italy, and Nigeria is currently the main country of origin of all the arrivals by sea to Europe. Yet, it's only present in 2% or less than 2% of the news items which were analyzed for this sample. Moving on. Other interesting findings come from the questions on the function in the news and the occupation of people identified as refugees and migrants. If we look first at the graph on occupation, so the one on the right, yeah. In 43% of the cases, the occupation of people is not stated, whereas in another 27% of the cases, the occupation is identified only as refugee or migrant or asylum seeker, as if this was an actual occupation rather than a temporary status of displacement. And if we look at the function in the news, we see that the vast majority, 67% of people, are present in the news as subjects, which in other words means that they are talked about. And this ties in with the next finding, which is on direct quotes, whereby we assume that when people are directly quoted, this is when they are more accurately represented by the media. And for the case of refugees and migrants, this happens only in the 40% of the total items that were analyzed in the sample. So far, the results are not very encouraging. However, we have some encouraging signs which come mostly from the questions dealing with the tone of the story. If we look at the last column, the total, we see that 50% of the stories are perceived as having a neutral tone. So the neutrality of reporting is a very important aspect, and is an aspect that was repeatedly stated throughout the conversation that were had in the framework of the project and throughout the consultation in Brussels. The role of journalism is and should be that of reporting with an objective, accurate, and factual overview, which then allows the reader to get to their own conclusions, and should not be instead that of advocating for or against any of the topic it talks about. And on this point, you see from the same graph that a third of the stories are perceived as having a sympathetic tone. Now, this may be a good sign, but it's also important to exercise a lot of caution, because the use or the abuse, if you will, of the sympathetic tone could run the risk, instead of getting into the victim paradigm, whereby people are identified as in need of assistance, of whatever kind of assistance, rather than people in their own right, with their own stories and expertise and experience to contribute to society. So as a final point, I would just like to highlight something that became very visible as the project was progressing, and that is a very strong need to have more occasions of meeting and discussion between refugees and media professionals. This is why the consultation in Brussels was organized, to provide one such opportunities, but of course, one is never enough. An improvement in the indicators that you've seen so far can come through an increased mutual understanding between refugees, migrants, and media professionals. And this improved mutual understanding can only be achieved through communication. And that is why ensuring that there are more opportunities for meeting and discussions is a fundamental aspect. So thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.